If you picture a wedding today, you might imagine a private story built on romance, personal choice, and a date circled on a calendar months in advance. But in ancient Rome, 2,000 years ago, marriage was rarely treated as a purely personal adventure. It was a public strategy, a social instrument, and a form of survival in a world where family name meant protection, inheritance meant stability, and reputation could elevate a household or ruin it for a generation. A Roman wedding was not designed first to express feelings but to secure a future, one measured in property, alliances, legitimacy, and heirs. Behind the veil and the music stood the hard architecture of Roman life: rank, law, and the relentless expectation that a family must endure. That is why we cannot begin with flowers and vows. We must begin with authority. In Rome, the household was a small empire ruled by the paterfamilias, the father whose legal power shaped the lives beneath his roof. He weighed names, fortunes, and social standing, because a marriage joined not only two individuals, but two networks of obligations, favors, and political possibilities. And once a match was decided, it did not float on sentiment. It was anchored by agreements, by promises spoken in formal ways, by the transfer of wealth that would bind the families together and protect the bride's future through dowry and legal custom. Only then could Rome move from private negotiation to public ritual, turning a contract into a visible transition, marked by symbols, processions, and sacred gestures meant to proclaim that a new household was being formed. Finally came the feast, not as an afterthought but as a public test of honor, generosity, and status, where the community watched and remembered who rose in dignity and who fell into embarrassment. To understand Roman weddings, we have to follow that same path: authority, contract, ritual, and celebration, because each step leads naturally to the next, and together they reveal how Rome used marriage to preserve power, secure lineage, and keep the machinery of society running across centuries. In ancient Rome, the first movement toward marriage did not begin with a couple wandering into love, but with a household weighing its place in the world. The Roman family was not merely a private unit of affection, it was a legal and social organism, and at its center stood the paterfamilias, the recognized head whose authority shaped decisions that could determine the future of everyone under his roof. His power was not only symbolic, it was written into custom and law, expressed in the right to approve unions, to negotiate terms, and to guard the family's standing with the same seriousness one might guard land or title. To him, a marriage was a doorway through which honor could enter or disgrace could invade, and so he measured possibilities with careful eyes. He considered the rank of another family, its alliances, its debts, its reputation in the neighborhood and in the wider network of Roman society. Because a wedding did not simply unite two people, it fused two lines of obligation and influence. The names that would be spoken at the feast mattered, the guests who would appear mattered, the whispers that would follow mattered, and even the children who might be born from the union mattered, because in Rome legitimacy was a form of power, and heirs were the proof that a household would not vanish into silence. This logic pressed most heavily upon the elite, where marriage could be as political as any public office. Among senators and noble families, unions were often planned with the precision of strategy, crafted to strengthen alliances, to mend rivalries, to secure patronage, or to widen access to wealth and prestige. Yet even beyond the marble halls of influence, the principle remained. Status was a language Rome spoke fluently, and marriage was one of its clearest sentences. A respectable match could lift a family's social security, ensuring support in hard seasons and protection in disputes. A careless match could invite contempt and weaken the fragile defenses that reputation provided. The bride's age, the groom's prospects, the stability of each household's labor and property, the moral standing of relatives, all were weighed not as cold numbers, but as the building blocks of survival in a city where fortune shifted quickly and scandal traveled faster. Personal attraction, if it grew, was expected to follow stability rather than create it. This was not because Romans were incapable of affection, but because the world they inhabited demanded foundations before feelings. A family that misjudged could lose face, lose leverage, and in certain cases lose the very protections that kept them safe. And so the arrangement of a marriage unfolded like a disciplined negotiation rather than a romantic confession. Families spoke, compared, and calculated, because Rome was a place where the public and the private lived tightly intertwined. Even the household gods, the traditions at the family hearth, and the story a family told about itself were part of what a match could offer. The question was never only whether two young people could live together, but whether two households could stand together, whether a bond could be formed that would endure scrutiny, resist rumor, and produce stability that others could recognize. In this beginning stage, the wedding was still distant, almost invisible, and yet it was already taking shape as something concrete, an agreement rooted in authority and guarded by the family's sense of honor. Once a decision settled into place, it did not remain a vague intention. It naturally demanded proof, structure, and public clarity, because in Rome, a promise that could not be reinforced by custom and wealth was too fragile to trust, and a future that relied on private emotion alone was too uncertain to build a household upon. In Rome, once a family's decision settled into certainty, the promise of marriage had to be given a shape that others could recognize, because a household's future could not rest on private intention alone. The engagement, known as sponsalia, was the threshold where negotiation hardened into obligation, where words became binding not through sentiment but through social expectation and legal weight. It was here that families exchanged formal assurances, often accompanied by symbolic gifts that made the agreement visible, memorable, and difficult to deny. An iron ring might appear, simple and unadorned, worn not as decoration but as a sign that a woman was no longer unclaimed in the public imagination. Rome understood the power of symbols precisely because symbols protected order. They announced to neighbors, rivals, and relatives that plans had been set in motion, that a union was being prepared, and that any attempt to disrupt it would strike not at two individuals, but at the honor of entire households. Yet the most decisive element was not the ring, nor even the spoken promises, but the transfer of wealth that turned a union into a stable institution. The dowry, the dowries, was the material backbone of Roman marriage, and its presence revealed the practical realism behind Roman ideals. A dowry was not a romantic offering. It was a financial foundation intended to support the new household, to strengthen the groom's capacity to provide and to protect the bride's standing within her new home. It could consist of money, land, jewelry, household goods, or other property, and the size of it carried meaning that everyone understood. A generous dowry signaled status, seriousness, and confidence in the match. A weak dowry could suggest vulnerability, limit a woman's leverage, or expose a family's declining fortunes. But beyond status, the dowry was also a safeguard, because Rome was not gentle with those left unprotected. Life could be cut short by illness, travel, violence, or political chaos, and a woman's future needed structure in a world where security was never guaranteed. The dowry helped secure that structure, functioning as a reserve that could, under many circumstances, be reclaimed if the marriage ended, whether through divorce or death. In this way, wealth was not merely displayed. It was organized into a system that made abandonment costly and instability less likely. Roman marriage also carried complexities that modern eyes often miss, especially in the way a woman's legal position could shift depending on the form of the union. Some marriages were arranged cum manu, in which the bride came under the legal authority of her husband, becoming in a sense part of his household as fully as a daughter would be. Others were sine manu, a form that became increasingly common, in which the bride remained legally connected to her birth family, retaining ties to her father's authority, and allowing her property and inheritance to be handled differently. These distinctions were not abstract technicalities. They shaped daily life, determined who controlled wealth, and influenced how power flowed through a household. In either case, the engagement and its arrangements were designed to prevent ambiguity, because ambiguity was dangerous. A Roman household needed to know where authority stood, where property belonged, who could speak for whom, and what claims could be made if conflict arose. Divorce, though possible and not rare in certain circles, was never merely personal. It had financial consequences, social consequences, and often political consequences. That is why the dowry mattered so much and why the engagement was treated as a serious step rather than a casual promise. What emerges from this stage is a portrait of marriage as something constructed, reinforced, and defended before it was celebrated. Rome did not rely on a single emotional moment to create permanence. It assembled permanence through commitments that could be witnessed, enforced, and remembered. The union was being prepared not only for the couple's private life, but for public life as well, because every Roman marriage existed under the gaze of community and tradition. And once the promise had been formalized and the dowry arranged, the marriage could move from the realm of agreement into the realm of spectacle, where law and wealth would be translated into ritual, and where the private decision of families would become a visible transition marked by symbols powerful enough for an entire city to understand. When the day of the wedding arrived in ancient Rome, it did not feel like the beginning of an impulsive adventure, but like the unveiling of something that had already been built quietly and deliberately. Even the choice of the date carried a careful seriousness, because Romans believed that the favor of the gods and the harmony of the household were intertwined. Certain times were avoided, certain days were preferred, and the household paid attention to signs and customs, not because every family lived in constant superstition, but because Rome understood that public life and sacred life overlapped, and a marriage that began under bad omens risked becoming a story told with worry. By the time the morning light settled on the streets, the bride's home became a place of focused preparation, where women of the household and close companions helped transform a young woman into a figure of public meaning. The clothing was not chosen only for beauty, it was chosen for symbolism, for the language it spoke without words. The bridal veil, often a vivid flame-colored covering known as the flammeum, was not merely fabric, but a signal that a threshold was being crossed, that a new household was about to be formed, and that the woman under it stood between her past identity and the life she would now be expected to carry. Her hair might be arranged in the traditional style called senicrines, divided and bound in a manner that echoed older religious patterns, suggesting that the bride was being prepared not only to be seen, but to be recognized within a long chain of Roman tradition. The atmosphere was not private in the modern sense. Even inside a home, a Roman wedding belonged to the community's awareness, because marriage shaped social order and the city depended on households that could endure. Ritual gestures turned an agreement into a visible change of status, and a series of actions marked the bride's passage from one set of protections and expectations to another. Religious elements could enter in different forms depending on wealth and custom. Offerings, small sacrifices, prayers to household deities, and attention to the guardians of the home, because Romans did not imagine the household as merely brick and wood. It was a moral space, a sacred space, and its stability was tied to the gods who watched over lineage, fertility, and domestic peace. In a culture that valued continuity so fiercely, the wedding was an attempt to align human intention with divine favor, not through elaborate sermons, but through ancient forms that carried the weight of memory. At the heart of the wedding, the union was expressed through symbols that were simple, yet dense with meaning. The joining of hands, dextrarum junctio, was more than a charming gesture. It was a public sign that two lives had entered a recognized bond, and that their households had bound themselves together. The presence of witnesses mattered, because witnesses protected truth. Words spoken before witnesses could not be easily denied later, and the act of being seen reinforced the legitimacy of the union. Rome valued legitimacy not as a sentimental ideal, but as a structural necessity, because legitimacy determined inheritance, citizenship, and the rightful continuation of the family line. In many settings, the wedding was less about a dramatic vow and more about the formal acknowledgement that a marriage existed within the accepted patterns of Roman society. Then came the procession, the moment when ritual became movement through space and private preparation became public transition. The bride did not simply leave her home as an individual. She departed as a symbol of a family's continuity being extended into another household. She was accompanied, guided, and surrounded, because the act of traveling from one home to another was itself part of the rite. Songs, torches, laughter, and rhythmic noise could fill the streets, not merely to entertain, but to declare that a threshold was being crossed in full view of the neighborhood. Rome was a world where reputation lived in the open, and the procession announced, as clearly as any public notice, that a new bond had been formed and recognized. In a city that measured itself by lineage and tradition, the movement of a bride through the streets was a kind of living proclamation. This household is expanding. This alliance stands. This future will continue. The arrival at the groom's home carried its own symbolic weight, because the doorway was not a neutral boundary. The threshold was a place of meaning in Roman thought, guarded by divine attention and marked by ritual. The bride might be lifted or guided so she did not stumble at the entrance, because stumbling could be interpreted as an unfortunate sign, and because the threshold represented the delicate line between what she had been and what she was about to become. Inside waited the new domestic order, the hearth, the household gods, the daily rhythm of responsibility, and the expectations attached to the role of a Roman wife. Her transition was not framed as an escape into romance, but as an entrance into a structure where she would be expected to preserve dignity, manage a household, and bear children who would carry the family name forward. The wedding day, therefore, was not a single moment, but a chain of meaningful actions, each linking the legal bond already established to a visible social reality that could not be ignored. And because Rome understood that a marriage could not survive on secrecy, the day's rituals naturally moved toward the public recognition that sealed the transition with communal memory. The union had been arranged and secured with wealth and law. Now it was being displayed as a living fact. Yet the wedding did not reach its full social force at the moment of arrival. The city's logic demanded more than a procession and symbolic gestures. It demanded public confirmation through hospitality, abundance, and the shared acknowledgement that this household could hold its place among others. The rituals of the day opened the door, but what followed would test the household's honor in the eyes of the community, because the wedding feast was where Rome measured not just love, but status, generosity, and the strength of a new beginning. The wedding in ancient Rome did not end when the bride crossed the threshold. In many ways, it only began to reveal its full meaning once the community gathered to eat, drink, and watch. The banquet was not a decorative extra, but a public declaration that the new household could stand with dignity among its neighbors. In a society that measured reputation through visible conduct, hospitality was a language of status, and the wedding feast was one of its loudest speeches. Families did not host simply to please guests. They hosted to demonstrate stability, generosity, and command over resources, because abundance on this day was interpreted as a promise about the days to come. A poorly offered celebration could stain the marriage's beginning with embarrassment, while a well-provided feast could strengthen respect and silence rumor. The bride and groom were not only being celebrated, they were being assessed, as if the city itself leaned closer to see whether this union would bring honor or invite doubt. Within that celebration, wealth became performance, but never as empty spectacle. The food, the seating, the quality of wine, the presence of notable guests, and the smooth organization of the gathering all carried implications. Rome was intensely aware of rank, and even joy obeyed social order. The arrangement of the room, the roles given to relatives, the greetings exchanged, the gifts offered, and the conversations formed around the tables created a living map of alliances. To be seen at a wedding meant something. It signaled support, confirmed ties, and sometimes hinted at future cooperation. For elite households, a wedding banquet could function like a subtle political stage where the strength of a family's network was displayed without a single official announcement. For more modest families, the same dynamic still existed, only translated into smaller measures. A humble but honorable feast could still communicate competence and respectability, reassuring the community that the marriage had not been formed recklessly. Yet beneath the music and laughter, another expectation remained constant, shaping how Romans viewed the very purpose of the union. A Roman marriage was oriented toward continuity, and continuity demanded children. Fertility was not treated as a private wish. It was a social hope pressed into ritual and conversation, spoken openly through blessings, jokes, and formal good wishes. The birth of legitimate heirs secured property lines, preserved names, and ensured that ancestors would be remembered rather than forgotten. In Rome's imagination, to vanish without descendants was to weaken the household's claim to significance. That is why the bride's new identity was not only relational, but functional. She was expected to bring stability to the domestic space, to embody dignity, and to contribute to the future of the family line. The celebration, therefore, carried an undercurrent of seriousness, a sense that joy was being offered not only for the present moment, but for the promise that this household would continue to exist. As the feast unfolded, the bride's integration into the new household became more than symbolic. She was now surrounded by unfamiliar routines, new relatives, and a different rhythm of authority, even if her legal ties to her birth family remained strong in certain forms of marriage. The public nature of the celebration acted like a social bridge. easing her transition by allowing the community to witness it. Being seen mattered because it created a collective memory. If disputes arose later, people would recall who supported whom, who honored the marriage, who attended, who offered gifts, and how the household presented itself. Rome relied on such memories because communities functioned through relationships and reputations more than through distant institutions. The feast was a kind of social cement, binding the union not only in law but in communal recognition, turning the marriage into a shared fact rather than a private arrangement. And when the guests finally dispersed, the true weight of the wedding settled into daily life. The new household faced the quiet tests that no ceremony could replace: managing resources, maintaining dignity, handling conflict, and meeting the expectations attached to the family's name. In Roman society, marriage was not a single day's event, but a long discipline, shaped by customs that demanded endurance. The feast had introduced the union to the world. Now the union had to justify that introduction by producing stability and legitimacy over time. If the household flourished, the marriage would be remembered as a wise alliance, a strong beginning, a foundation for descendants who could extend the family's reach. If it failed, the same community that once celebrated would interpret the collapse through the same Roman lens of honor and expectation, turning private struggle into public narrative. In this way, the wedding feast served as the final visible seal of everything that came before, translating authority, contract, and ritual into social reality, and sending a newly formed household into the city's gaze with a reputation that would either grow stronger with years or fracture under pressure.